In March of 2007, Hollywood woke up to a scandal no one saw coming. A hidden journal belonging to Burt Lancaster, one of the most respected actors of his time, was uncovered, and what it revealed shook the industry to its core. This wasn't a memoir filled with nostalgia or confessions of regret. Lancaster had left behind a list. 10 names. Each one belonged to a star adored by millions. Yet Lancaster described them as the most dangerous people he ever met in Hollywood. The words he used weren't casual. They read more like a warning, or a curse. Behind the glamour and red carpets, Lancaster painted a picture of cruelty, manipulation and power games, so dark they make you wonder how much of Hollywood's golden age was really made of gold at all. Lancaster didn't waste time easing into his list. He opened with the name he considered the cruelest of them all, a man Hollywood praised as a hero, but who, according to Lancaster, lived more like a predator than a star. Kirk Douglas, predator beneath the hero. Kirk Douglas was one of Hollywood's most celebrated figures, the face of epic heroes and larger-than-life warriors who seemed to embody courage itself. Audiences saw him as a symbol of strength and honor, a man who could carry entire films on his back. But according to Burt Lancaster's secret journal, that heroic image was nothing more than a mask. Behind the scenes, Douglas was described as ruthless, calculating, and willing to crush anyone who stood in his way. Lancaster wrote that Douglas's power didn't just come from talent or charm. It came from fear. He allegedly used his influence to bend producers and directors to his will, making or breaking careers with a single word. For young actresses, the stakes were even higher. Lancaster claimed Douglas manipulated them with private invitations that were impossible to refuse without consequences. One actress in the late 1950s supposedly lost a starring role after declining his advances. Her career halted overnight while Douglas's continued to soar. The journal also suggests that Douglas relied on darker tools of control. Lancaster accused him of supplying and exploiting substances to pressure others into silence or obedience. Those who resisted didn't just lose opportunities, they were pushed out of projects entirely, their reputations quietly dismantled. In Lancaster's eyes, Douglas wasn't simply ambitious or competitive. He was a predator disguised as a Hollywood legend, someone who thrived on domination and left behind a trail of broken careers and silenced voices. And as disturbing as that sounds, Douglas was only the beginning. Lancaster's next name revealed a story even more chilling. Natalie Wood, fragility as power. Natalie Wood captivated audiences with her haunting beauty and an aura of vulnerability that made her one of Hollywood's most beloved stars. To the world, she was fragile, delicate, almost untouchable. But Burt Lancaster's journal told a different story, one where that fragility wasn't a weakness, but a weapon. According to Lancaster, Wood had mastered the art of control through manipulation. On one film set, she allegedly staged a sudden fainting spell, halting production for nearly half a day. The reason? She wanted a co-star removed, and the chaos she created pushed the producer into firing him. To outsiders, it looked like an unfortunate accident. To Lancaster, it was calculated, a performance even more convincing than anything she did on camera. Her reputation for quiet ruthlessness followed her through the industry. Actors and directors were wary of crossing her, fearful that one wrong step could end their careers. And just weeks before her death in 1981, Lancaster claimed that Wood threatened to destroy a friend's reputation if they didn't comply with her demands. It was a chilling foreshadowing that made her sudden death on that yacht feel less like an accident and more like the closing act of a dangerous life. Lancaster wrote, "The sea didn't take her. It only covered what she left behind on shore." For him, her downfall was not random tragedy, but the price of a life built on deception and manipulation. And if Natalie's story sounds unsettling, Lancaster's next revelation pulls us even deeper into Hollywood's shadows, this time with a star whose laughter hit a razor's edge. Lucille Ball, the razor-edged smile. To millions of fans, Lucille Ball was the very face of joy. Her laugh lit up living rooms across America, and her show defined an entire era of television. She was the nation's comedy queen, a symbol of warmth and optimism. But Burt Lancaster's journal painted a starkly different picture, one where that famous laugh was less about happiness and more about control. As the head of Desilu Productions, Ball commanded enormous power, and according to Lancaster, she wielded it with ruthless precision. He claimed she kept a notebook that tracked the mistakes of her staff, everything from how they answered a phone to how they knocked on her door. Anyone who repeated the same error 3 times was fired, no explanations, no second chances. To those under her, it wasn't comedy. It was survival. One story in the journal described how she allegedly forced a writer to redo an entire script overnight. The next morning, she called him into a meeting, laughed as she held the pages in her hands, and then ripped them apart in front of the entire staff. What the audience saw as charm, her employees remembered as humiliation. Lancaster even claimed she went so far as to install hidden microphones in meeting rooms, listening to private conversations to uncover disloyalty. Those caught speaking out against her faced unpredictable consequences, from sudden demotions to public ridicule. Her laugh might have saved a network, but according to Lancaster, it also crushed the spirits of everyone beneath her. And if Ball's story feels like betrayal, the next one reveals chaos on an even greater scale. Marilyn Monroe, the black hole of Hollywood. Marilyn Monroe remains one of the most iconic figures in Hollywood history, a symbol of beauty, vulnerability, and desire. On screen, she radiated innocence and charm, captivating audiences in ways few ever could. But Burt Lancaster's journal stripped away that glamorous image, describing Monroe not as a victim of fame, but as someone who learned to weaponize it. According to Lancaster, Monroe wielded her fragile persona as a tool of control. On the set of Some Like It Hot, she would vanish without warning, leaving entire crews paralyzed for hours. Production stalled, directors panicked, and co-stars walked on eggshells. Lancaster suggested this wasn't just carelessness or insecurity, it was deliberate. By keeping everyone waiting, she made sure the world revolved around her. Behind closed doors, Lancaster claimed Monroe's manipulation extended to her relationships. He recounted her alleged affair with a powerful producer, where emotional breakdowns were staged to force decisions that worked only in her favor. What looked like a fragile woman overwhelmed by the pressures of stardom, Lancaster described as a carefully rehearsed performance designed to bend others to her will. The journal painted her less as a tragic figure consumed by Hollywood and more as a force that consumed those around her. She didn't collapse under the weight of fame, Lancaster wrote. She made others collapse beneath it. If you're enjoying uncovering these hidden stories, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next revelations. The secrets only get darker from here. But if Monroe's story feels unsettling, Lancaster's next revelation is even more disturbing. A beloved leading man whose rage and violence turned dressing rooms into war zones. Spencer Tracy, Devil in the Dressing Room. Spencer Tracy was one of Hollywood's most respected actors, a man whose performances carried a depth and honesty that critics praised as timeless. On screen, he played men of integrity and conviction, the kind of roles that earned him 2 Academy Awards and the adoration of fans worldwide. But in Burt Lancaster's journal, Tracy's name carried none of that nobility. Instead, Lancaster described him as a figure ruled by anger, intimidation, and an addiction that became a weapon. Tracy's drinking, Lancaster wrote, wasn't just self-destruction, it was a tool of control. He would arrive on set, fueled by alcohol, using his rages to terrify colleagues into submission. One incident Lancaster recalled took place during the filming of Judgment at Nuremberg. After spotting a minor mistake by a makeup artist, Tracy allegedly shattered a liquor bottle against a table, sending glass across the room. To those present, it wasn't simply a tantrum, it was a warning. The journal also claimed Tracy relied on psychological tactics as much as violence. He would threaten to quit productions, stage dramatic breakdowns, or even hint at ending his own life to force directors and co-stars into compliance. For Lancaster, these weren't the actions of a troubled genius. They were deliberate moves by a man who used fear as currency. Spencer Tracy may have been remembered by the public as a saintly performer, but in Lancaster's eyes, he was a devil in the dressing room, a man whose power came not from talent alone, but from the terror he inspired. And if Tracy's fury was shocking, the next story hit even harder. The man America once trusted as its most wholesome hero. James Stewart, the silent saboteur. James Stewart built his career on playing the everyman. With his warm drawl and earnest presence, he became the face of decency in films like It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. To audiences, he was the embodiment of honesty, the man who always stood for what was right. But Burt Lancaster's journal shattered that image, describing Stewart as a cold manipulator who thrived on quiet destruction rather than open conflict. According to Lancaster, Stewart rarely raised his voice or displayed anger. Instead, he would quietly take notes on his co-stars' mistakes during filming. At the end of the day, those notes would be handed to the director, not to help the production, but to slowly erode the reputation of anyone who threatened his position. To work alongside him was to feel constantly watched, judged, and undermined. One story in the journal accused Stewart of going even further. During the late 1950s, he allegedly refused to appear opposite a black actor, disguising his prejudice behind script concerns and technical excuses. Lancaster claimed this allowed Stewart to maintain his wholesome image while forcing others to carry the weight of his decisions. Even more chilling were the accusations that Stewart would forge documents, creating false evidence to smear rivals. With a single piece of paper, he could ruin a career without ever raising suspicion. Lancaster described him as a man who didn't need to shout or fight. He only had to sit quietly, and everyone around him felt small, unworthy, and powerless. And if Stewart's betrayal of trust feels unsettling, the next name revealed a much darker cruelty, hidden not on film sets, but within the walls of a family home. Bing Crosby, cruelty behind the calm. Bing Crosby was one of the most beloved entertainers of the 20th century. With his velvet voice and calm demeanor, he was the man who sang America through the Great Depression and became the soundtrack of Christmas with White Christmas. To the public, Crosby was the picture of composure, soft-spoken, gentle, even fatherly. But Burt Lancaster's journal stripped that image apart, revealing a man who ruled his private world with fear. Behind closed doors, Crosby allegedly turned his home into a place of psychological torment. Lancaster claimed Crosby punished his children with cold, calculated methods designed to break their spirit. One disturbing account described him forcing his son to stand shirtless outside in the freezing cold as punishment for a poor grade, telling him that failure needed to be felt. For Lancaster, this was not discipline but cruelty disguised as parenting. The journal also accused Crosby of using intimidation as a daily weapon, his quiet stare often more terrifying than any outburst. He rarely needed to raise his voice. His silence alone carried the weight of punishment. Years later, one of Crosby's own sons, Gary, confirmed the abuse in his memoir, describing his father as a man who used fear as casually as most use conversation. In Lancaster's eyes, Crosby's legacy wasn't one of soothing songs and holiday cheer, but of scars carried by the people closest to him. The world adored his voice, but his family lived under the shadow of his cruelty. And if Crosby's story feels unsettling, the next name shows what happens when charm and glamour are used not to inspire but to corrupt. Errol Flynn, glamour masking a predator. Errol Flynn was the very definition of swashbuckling charm. With his dazzling smile and effortless charisma, he brought Robin Hood, pirates, and adventurers to life, becoming one of Hollywood's most magnetic stars. Audiences saw him as the eternal rogue, reckless, daring, irresistibly fun. But Burt Lancaster's journal tore away that glamorous image, describing Flynn not as a free spirit, but as a man who used charm as camouflage for cruelty. Lancaster claimed Flynn's parties were infamous not for their glamour, but for their darkness. Behind the locked doors of his mansion, substances flowed freely, violence was common, and guests often left broken in more ways than one. To outsiders, it looked like wild excess. To Lancaster, it was predation disguised as celebration. Even more disturbing were Flynn's alleged escapes from justice. Arrests for trafficking and possession were quietly erased, Lancaster wrote, thanks to powerful allies in the industry who couldn't afford to see their golden boy fall. Time and again, Flynn walked away unscathed, leaving behind victims who had no power to speak out. The journal described him as a man who treated people as disposable, their value measured only by how well they fed his appetites. Once they had nothing left to give, they were discarded without a second thought. For Lancaster, Flynn wasn't the daring hero he portrayed on screen. He was a predator cloaked in glamour, a reminder that the brightest smiles often hide the darkest intentions. And while Flynn's story exposed the dangers of unchecked indulgence, Lancaster's next revelation showed cruelty hidden in plain sight. Mickey Rooney, the sadist behind the smile. Mickey Rooney was one of Hollywood's most familiar faces, a child star who grew into a performer known for lighthearted roles and infectious energy. To audiences, he was approachable, funny, even lovable. But in Burt Lancaster's journal, Rooney's cheerful mask slipped away, revealing a man who thrived not on laughter but on cruelty. Lancaster described Rooney as a verbal sadist, someone who took pleasure in tearing others down. On film sets, background actors and crew members often became his targets. He would mock their appearance, belittle their work, and do it loudly enough for everyone to hear. According to Lancaster, Rooney seemed to enjoy watching people crumble under humiliation, smiling as if each insult were a small victory. The cruelty, Lancaster claimed, didn't stop at work. Behind closed doors, Rooney's marriages became cycles of control and abuse. Wives were allegedly treated less like partners and more like servants, forced into submission through fear and manipulation. One account even described a violent outburst on a film set where Rooney slapped his wife in front of the crew because she was running late. The physical and emotional scars, Lancaster suggested, were part of a long pattern. To the outside world, Rooney was the mischievous boy who never grew up. To those closest to him, he was a man who wielded power through ridicule and violence. Lancaster's description was blunt. Rooney's smile was never about joy, it was about dominance. Lancaster ended his list with one of Hollywood's brightest stars, a woman adored for her beauty, but feared for the storms she created off-screen. That woman was Elizabeth Taylor, the storm behind violet eyes. Elizabeth Taylor was more than a movie star. She was Hollywood royalty. With her striking violet eyes and a string of unforgettable performances, she seemed untouchable, adored by fans and courted by studios. But in Burt Lancaster's journal, Taylor's name carried a warning. Behind the glamour, he described a woman whose fury and manipulation could bring entire productions to their knees. One story Lancaster recounted took place during the filming of Cleopatra in Rome. When Taylor discovered a co-star wearing a gown in the same shade as hers, she locked herself in her dressing room and refused to return. The production shut down for hours, losing thousands of dollars, until Taylor emerged only to hurl a glass of wine at the director's face. For Lancaster, it wasn't diva behavior, it was power, wielded like a weapon. Her personal life, he claimed, was no less calculated. Taylor's many marriages weren't fairy tales of passion, but strategic unions that expanded her influence. Richard Burton, Mike Todd, Eddie Fisher, each relationship, according to the journal, strengthened her control within the industry. Love may have been part of the story, but power was always at the center. Lancaster's words painted Taylor as a queen, not just of Hollywood's screens, but of its politics. She orchestrated her world with fire, bending studios and lovers alike to her will. And with her, Lancaster's list came to an end, a final reminder that Hollywood's brightest icons often cast the darkest shadows. Burt Lancaster's secret journal wasn't just a list of names. It was a mirror held up to Hollywood's golden age, showing that beneath the glitter lived shadows most fans never imagined. Heroes, comedians, icons of beauty, each carried secrets that painted a darker picture of fame. For Lancaster, exposing them seemed less like revenge and more like a warning that behind the smiles, applause, and flashing cameras, power was often built on fear, manipulation, and silence. So the question lingers, were these legends victims of Hollywood's system, or were they the architects of its darkest secrets?